There we go.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's important national conversation regarding racial disparities in funding among scientists. My name is Stephen Rapundelow. I'm president and CEO of the Michigan Biosciences Industry Association, or otherwise known as MichBio. And before we begin, I'd like to thank our good friends and key partners in this event, the California Life Sciences Association, Biocom, Life Sciences Washington, MassBio and MassMedic, and at the national level, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. In addition, our appreciation goes out to all of our other sister state bioorganizations who helped raise awareness of the program. And with everyone's help, we have an amazing turnout across some, I think, almost 24 states. So thank you for joining us today. A quick logistical note, please submit any questions for the panelists in the Q&A area during the program, and we'll get to as many as time permits. The event is being recorded, and we'll be happy to share it afterwards. So it's a privilege for me to turn over the program to our esteemed panel, and I'd like to thank them for their courage and passion and commitment in shedding light what I think is a gross injustice in research funding that impacts scientific careers and personal lives too. And so to lead today's conversation, please welcome Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath, the president and CEO of BIO. Michelle?
Thank you so much, Stephen, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath. I'm the president and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, and I just want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are all here because we recognize the importance of increasing equitable health outcomes, but doing so requires that we examine the process by which we fund scientific research. And the best ways to reduce the funding disparities between Black and white scientists. So to that end, I hope this conversation will produce a few clear takeaways and really give us a call to action. We have many of the leaders of this effort here with us today. These 4 panelists were part of a group of authors that recently published an article in Cell calling for greater action from the NIH. So let me introduce them before asking my first question, and I'm just going to go one by one. So Dr. Lola Enola Aldefaso is the University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor of Chemical Engineering and Biomedical Engineering at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She's also the Associate Director of the Cellular Biotechnology Training Program and Vice Chair for Graduate Studies in Chemical Engineering. Next, we have Dr. Hannah El-Samad. Dr. El-Samad is the Kuo Family Endowed Professor and Vice Chair of the Department of Biochemistry and Biophysics at the University of California, San Francisco, and the California Institute for Quantitative Biosciences. Third, Dr. Kelly Stevens is a University of Washington Assistant Professor of Bioengineering and Pathology. Dr. Stevens' lab is developing new technologies to assemble synthetic human tissues from stem cells and to remotely control these tissues after implantation into a patient. And last but not least, Dr. Rebecca Wilpitz is chairperson and professor, and ladies, you'll have to correct me if I've mispronounced any names, is chairperson and professor of chemical engineering at Northeastern University. She's a member of the board of directors and the diversity committee at the Biomedical Engineering Society. So, ladies, I know all of us have seen a lot of conversation about disparities in science funding over the years. It's hard for me to believe that I was the first NIH funded MD PhD student to graduate from Duke, and I finished in 2000. So it tells you that this field has been slow in moving. So despite the landmark 2011 study validating the long-held belief that African-American scientists were significantly less likely to receive federal research funding, little headway has been made to really address the problem. Can you tell us why this matters and what impact does this have on the future of science?
Yeah, first, thank you so much for hosting us. We're delighted for this platform. I think that's a great question that you ask. Why does it matter and why should we care, right? What we're talking about is research funding from the NIH, which is the lead funder of biomedical research in the US. It's not going to African-American Black PIs at the same rate that is going to others. The problem there, of course, is that grant funding is the currency of academic institutions. This is part of how you are evaluated for promotion and tenure for leadership positions. And so when a group is not getting funded, and the reasoning behind the disparity is not the quality of their science, it's not the quality of their training, it just exists, right? You end up in situations where many of these faculty members don't persist. They leave the profession. And that might sound like, okay, well, it's their problem. But the problem is, no, it's all of our problems, right? When you don't have diverse faculty doing research, and we now know that a lot of the technology that goes out there, biomedical technology, is born in academic labs. So you have a situation where not all Americans are involved in innovation and technology that is supposed to work for all of America. So that's one problem. And we see examples of that. I think we just got a slide deck posted in the chat that highlights examples of technology that essentially are behaving in racist ways, okay? The other piece is we know that faculty members and their presence in the classroom is important for the diversity of our classroom. So if you do not have these African-American faculty members in the academic institution teaching and leading research, then you do not have students looking up and aspiring in those disciplines, right? And so we end up not graduating diverse biomedical researchers. We don't have diverse engineers, and we don't have diverse STEM students. And that then extrapolates to our industry. And this is a key point to make to this audience. When you don't have a diverse workforce, you are experiencing all kinds of things, including leaving money on the table. You don't build technology that diverse people want to buy because you didn't have their voice on the table. I'm at Michigan, and our automotive industry had to deal with this quite a bit. Only when they brought women to the table were they able to make cars that women wanted to buy. And now they're leaving African-American, Hispanic Americans out of the room, then you're making products that they won't be interested in buying. So you're leaving money on the table. So that's another piece of it. But really, the part where we all will have to deal with this down the line is this recognition that the demographics of America is changing, right? In 2030, we're gonna be a majority minority country. All right, and so if we have a situation where our academic institutions are not prepared to educate a more diverse student body, then we have a situation where we will not have enough workforce for our companies. And then our global competitiveness is impacted. So, and these are just snippets of things that this little tiny funding disparity is actually going to impact down the line. I don't know if I missed anything. My colleagues can jump in and add to that.
Well, I'll add to the question. So I see Dr. Willits nodding her head in agreement. Maybe you could give some more nuances to that and talk about what are some of the barriers? What are some of the actual impediments to this more equitable funding?
I can start with that one. That's part of the problem here is that the barriers are not always visible barriers. Okay, so they're cultural. We, especially folks with skin color like mine, want so desperately to be colorblind, at least many of us, right? We want an equitable society. We want to be colorblind. Yet the data shows and all of our disparities show that we're not colorblind. And so possibly the biggest barrier is our culture and our society, and the fact that we have good intentions, but racism and bias transpire in very insidious ways that we're often not even aware of. And so we're frankly, also folks with skin color like mine are often always in the positions of power, more often than not in positions of power. Okay, and so if we want to be colorblind and we're uncomfortable with facing this problem head on by talking about uncomfortable issues such as race, we won't be able to solve this. And so the biggest barrier might simply be, let's have these conversations, let's get a little bit uncomfortable so that we can address this problem head on.
Wonderful. So there's so many questions for you. This is so fascinating. So you, in your recent Cell article on funding Black scientists, you write, at least 10 editorials have been written about this NIH racial funding disparity with no signs of real effort from NIH or other entities to dismantle it. Meanwhile, our Black colleagues continue to be disenfranchised. We need radical solutions that produce racial funding equity now. Can you tell us what some of those specific solutions might be to ensure racial funding equity?
Yeah, so we outline many of these things in the article. So I refer the audience to take a look at that article, but I'll summarize them quickly. At first, I want to say the first thing we asked NIH to do was acknowledge that there was a problem, and we are deeply grateful that the NIH director did that a couple of weeks ago. So that's exciting, and we feel, as Dr. Stevens highlighted, the first step is acknowledging there's a problem. So we're excited about that. But then we asked that there needs to be work done to fix this disparity immediately, right? Just create mechanisms to fund and to close this gap, right? So we're just asking for the gap to be closed so that when people are applying for grants, they have equal footing, equal shot at winning those grants. Again, there's tons of data both in the original paper and follow-up publication showing quite nicely that this disparities is not due to any metrics of excellence. It really just is a disparity that exists that really can be only attributed to the race issue. So we ask them to create a mechanism to close the gap. And then we say part of the problem, as Dr. Stephen was alluding to, is the fact that the team that is making decisions on what grants get funded or not, which are the review panels, quite often, as you sort of highlighted, Dr. McMurray, is still not diverse in 2021. Many study sections will struggle to have a non-white or African-American or Black panelists on the review panel. And we have tons of data in the literature, well-designed studies that shows that when you have diverse team, you make better product. Again, our automotive industry have learned this and they've seen results. And so if we have a team that is making decisions on what grant is innovative or not, and that team is not diverse, one asks the question, are they really coming up with the most optimal decision, right? So we ask NIH to diversify, work immediately to diversify this review panels, and that the goal should be to match the population of the United States. The scholars that we are graduating at the PhD level, both Black, African-American, Hispanic, Latinx, Native American, we have enough number, much more than what is represented on the NIH study section. So they just need to we ask for them to work harder to do this. And then we ask if we all understand that diversity breeds innovation. NIH in its website talk about this mission of the organization to ensure that we have a diverse biomedical workforce. Why do we then not factor diversity of the team of the proposal in how we make decisions for funding, right? It is both scientific and anecdotal evidence that diverse team perform better. So therefore, in scientific research, diverse team will perform better. We do not have that luxury right now when we make decision and review grants. So we ask them to think about modifying their review process to do that, and that they should prioritize those diverse team when they do find them for funding. That will go a long way in closing this gap, because you have situations where many of these diverse scholars, African-American scholars, will be on teams if those teams are going to be prioritized for funding. And then finally, we ask that the decisions, the ways NIH make decisions on which grants to fund outside their pay lines, that it should be more transparent, so that we understand how decisions are being made, and that people can play on an equal footing.
So let's break this down a little bit. I read your Cell article. I found it fascinating. And of course, it kind of resonated in a way that said, yes, this makes sense. I understand this to be my reality. But for those who don't feel like it's the reality they see in front of them, can we talk a little bit more about this funding disparity, the mechanism of this funding disparity? So you say that it's not based on metrics of excellence. How do we know for sure that the minority students and professors aren't as successful because their science is just not of that quality? Because I guarantee you, we all get this question a million times, and you guys have dug into the research, and I would love to hear your perspective on what is your proof? What's your scientific analysis that these scientists are just as deserving as their white counterparts?
Yeah, so I mean, Kelly, it sounds like you want to jump in on this one.
The first thing I have to say about that, that used to be me as a white person. And what I realized a few years ago now was that that was what society bred into me. And it was a horrifying realization. And it took a lot of studying to start to overcome it. And so the first thing I can say is to everybody that's watching right now, especially people who have white skin, if that's your gut reaction, know that you're not alone. It's the vast majority of our society that's white. And it means you have studying to do, number one. A simple panel like this will not allow you to overcome it. You must study, you must read, okay? Start with classic anti-racism books, okay? Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, Ijeoma, okay? These are, you must do this for our society to move forward. That's number one. And then the second is, when it truly sank into me was when I started working with Dr. Aniola DeFesso. She's probably the smartest person I've ever met in my life, okay? And frankly, if I hadn't had the opportunity to work with her, I might not have realized that, okay? And so form collaborations. Our job is not to help Black people, okay, as white people. Our job is not to help. Our job is to collaborate with, empower. And I guarantee you that if you do a little bit of reading and learning, and this is your gut reaction, I guarantee you if you do a little bit of reading and learning, and then if you collaborate with and work with these Black scientists, you're going to find that they're so much smarter than most of us white scientists, because if they've made it this far, they've had to overcome substantive barriers. And so instead of just spewing out the data for you so that everybody can learn it in a passive way, I would instead push that back on my white colleagues and say, y'all, get with the modern day society, okay? We cannot tell you all of the data in a 1 hour thing. This requires you to do some work. And I would say, each one of you do the work.
Got it. Dr.
will also-
Willits, Dr. Elsaman, Dr. Elsaman.
I just want to jump in just, for a moment to say that actually the data out there, I support and endorse everything that Kelly has said, but I would say that there's a lot of data out there. Some of it is referenced a couple of papers that appear that analyze this kind of question, normalizing for things like career stage, institution that the applicant got their PhD from, their impact factor, this and that actually break all of this down. And even when you normalize for all of that, the inequity remains. So these two papers, the two main papers that do this breakdown, are referenced in our perspective. So I encourage everybody to go and read them and dive into these data. And then the picture becomes clearer in a quantitative way. The second point I really want to make is, those of you who are familiar with the NIH system know that there are a pay line below which, if council approves, these grants are going to get funded. Above that pay line, it becomes a little bit more subjective, and it goes to the courtesy of the program officers and of the strategic priorities of the institutes and of NIH. The disparity there in that gray zone is actually quite substantial and quite documented. White investigators are way more likely to be subjectively, because they're above the pay line, picked for funding. And I think we need to examine that. And that could be quantitatively assessed too.
That's very interesting, because for those who aren't familiar with the NIH system, above that line, everyone's considered qualified to receive the grant. So then it's just a question of not having enough money to fund all the qualified applicants. So you're taking qualifications off the table. Dr. Willits, did you have something you wanted to chime in on this point as well?
I think both Kelly and Hannah, really hit the points, but it's really an evaluation of the people who really evaluated the data, right? So they're the social scientists who went through and dug through and made sure that their assessment was for the NIH was correct. And so I think that that's our base, that's our starting point as a white scientist in this, is you have to really look at what's out there and, realize that that's not the evaluation of it is data-based. We're not looking for, nobody's looking for a handout. Nobody's looking for nobody's looking to say that an entity or a society is racist, but it's there and it exists. And so I think that it's our, I feel like it's our job to recognize it and to find solutions to mitigate the problem. And so this is not it's a call to action on something that's been 10 years studied, and that there are no solutions proposed. And it's and if you just sit back and think about it from just a research perspective, right? We're researchers. This is a research problem. There's data presented that this problem exists. If it were cancer, if it were COVID, it would be addressed, right? We put money at it. We say, here's the problem. Where's the solution? A year later, we have a vaccine. This is a problem that exists. We know it exists, and we want solutions. And so I think that's what this call for action is we want immediate solutions for a problem that's 10 years studied and existing.
And can I add to that, Dr. Willits, the thing that I like to say in my talks is, if we're not willing to treat this problem, which we know kills thousands to millions of Americans, why aren't we? Okay. And so either there's a full database, there's a full bank of data that supports this problem, right? As Dr. Elsaman said. So why aren't we able to, as individuals and scientists, fix this one? It's either because we're bad scientists, we're not willing to listen to the data, or we're not doing literature analyses, we're intentionally disregarding the data. So why is it for this particular situation, we cannot stomach just solving it? And this is where that insidious cultural bias, we want to be colorblind, but we're not, we're uncomfortable, AKA racism, comes into play. And so if that is the gut reaction, like I can't just solve this problem like the others, like COVID-19 or cancer, that we really need to examine.
Can I jump in to actually also, I really, there is one point here that I really want to emphasize, and this is, Lola touched upon that. And I think it is crucial for us to understand, which is that diversity drives innovation. And the point I want to make is that this is not an opinion. This is also backed by scholarly studies, and we can point, our audience to scholarly work that actually supports that. So aside from social justice and the need for all of us to live in a more just and equitable society, there is an economic argument that has to be made about, as Lola puts it, leaving money on the table. It affects our health, it affects our kids, it affects our economy, and it affects our position, scientific and technological position in the world. And we should also put this argument forward, in addition to the social justice one, to solve this problem.
Fascinating. I always hear about NIH study sections as a zero-sum game, and you can think of it on that micro level or on the meta level. So doctors, if we're talking about reapportioning grant funding to more minority scientists, that presupposes a decreased success rate for some of the white scientists who are currently in the NIH system. Have you considered this? How have you thought about this? Because we've seen this with disease group versus disease group. The zero-sum NIH game comes to the fore. So when we're talking about equitable funding, we're talking about changing that balance. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I'll start. Here is my thought. When you go in our paper, we have a visual that's just beautiful, which is the total pie for NIH funding. This gap that we're talking about, this disparity, is a tiny dot. It's like dropping a dye in an ocean, right? So from that context, mathematically speaking, it is not a zero-sum game, right? It is a matter of just allocating funds from the general pool, for example, to correct this disparity. Then we can do all the wonderful things that we want to do in terms of training the study section, training the program officers, diversifying the study section. We need to close the gap first. And the amount of money will not have a dent on any other type of PI if done right. And so that's sort of why we are making that bold call to say, just fund them, just close the gap.
Any other thoughts, reactions?
We can give the numbers. The NIH budget is approximately $40 billion, 40 billion with a B. The amount of money that we calculated to close the gap, which has been, we've been told that that number is quite accurate, is about 32 million. Okay, it is a drop in the bucket. Furthermore, NIH has just, for example, invested 240 million in pipeline filling programs, so several times the size of the 32 million, okay? What we're saying is that that money is being, I don't want to say carelessly or wastefully invested, but it starts to go in that direction, because if we're filling the pipeline only such that these people, these incredible faculty later drop out, this is a complete waste of money, okay? And so if we're thoughtful about how we do this, it does not have to, well, first of all, even if it affects white scientists like myself, fine, that's what it takes, right? But it actually doesn't have to. We're talking about using resources more wisely. We're talking about using taxpayer dollars of all Americans more wisely, more carefully, more thoughtfully, so that we actually address the problem that we're all collectively trying to address together.
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize what Dr. Stevens is suggesting, that this pipeline money, right? This are money to K through 12, for example. This are money to trainee, right? Let's get more graduate students that are diverse, because diverse students. Okay, let's fund more diverse postdoc. The problem is there's this big clog in the pipe. So then you keep shoving stuff in, the leak gets bigger and bigger, right? And there is no forward motion. So if only a fraction of that money that went to create a bigger leak is rerouted to unclog this crucial piece, then you have people moving forward and we'd be able to catch up. Again, decades in the making and a lot of money going to pipeline issues, and we've not seen a correction. If you look at the data, the fraction of science and engineering faculty that are Black, that number has been flat for 15 years, flat.
Wow. All right, ladies.
Can I jump in?
Oh,
actually, I
do.
have a really, important point to add here as, kind of an administrator. We all live, all our institutions live directly or indirectly through funding from funding agencies such as the NIH. When we hire, young people and we give them a multi-million-dollar startup package to get them started, and then they stall, that's wasting the investment that NIH put in us. So I think you have to think about the problem beyond just the budget of NIH. It's a bigger ecosystem. And if you have to do the calculation for the full ecosystem. When the young faculty I hire to my department doesn't succeed, that's a loss to NIH. And that loss is much bigger than the $37 or so million that would help to fix that discrepancy. The other, now I'm gonna be a little bit, make an emotional point, which is, and I'm gonna turn inside, look at the statistics inside of the investigators inside NIH. So the numbers were released recently. So 25% of senior NIH investigators, including distinguished NIH investigators, so these are intramural women, which is a horrifying number. But you know what is another horrifying number? 4.3%, 4.3% are Black and Hispanic. That's it. 33% of the population of this country are Black and Latinx.
Wow. Well,
so you want numbers? These are the numbers.
Let's start to talk even more.
We have to talk about that.
Yes, let's start to talk even more Turkey, because I think this is actually a perfect lead in. So you mentioned that Francis Collins, the leader of the National Institutes of Health, joined with Janet Woodcock, the acting director of the Food and Drug Administration, just about a week ago, to acknowledge their agency's role in historic systemic racism. And NIH also recently announced their Unite program, which outlines steps to address these inequities. I'd love to get your reactions and your thoughts to these initiatives. Will they make a difference? And if not, how should they be tweaked or changed or expanded?
So
I threw out the hot potato.
We were so excited when Dr. Francis Collins made this announcement. We were so excited and energized. And I'll be honest, when the Unite program was then rolled out and half of our team was watching it, it was a big letdown. Let me tell you why. The acknowledgement is a huge step. Okay, thank you for the acknowledgement. But the problem is we're sort of past the time of sorry. Okay, this nationwide awakening has been a year in coming now, or it's happened, it was a year ago, okay? Now is the time for action. And so here's the things that Unite is missing. Okay, it kind of feels like it's another program, only now we're calling it racism. It's another diversity program, okay? The question is it? Can we take it forward? Maybe so, but if so, Dr. Francis Collins needs to, number one, treat it like COVID. Where's the funding? How much funding is behind Unite? Make it transparent, make it clear, make it big. That's totally unclear so far, okay? Where's the actions? Are there any tangible, specific actions that Unite has laid out to say, this is the thing we're going to target? Fund Black scientists. We'll fix racial funding disparity as the first step. We will fix it, and we'll fix it by June of 2021. Okay, that's has not happened. We have not seen that yet. Okay, I say yet because I'm still optimistic that I know there's NIH folks on the call and stuff, and so I'm sort of daring you to say, let's take the action. It is time, right? And then the last one is power. Does Unite have power? We're not sure. Dr. Francis Collins, does Unite have power? And what I mean by that is, if Unite says we need to do X, Y, and Z, do all of the institutes have to do that? We're not sure. That has been completely unclear. Or is it just going to be some other diversity program that white people in power put people of color and diversity advocates in a box and tell them to work on their problem, give us suggestions, which we later will take some small piece of, okay? That's how diversity programs have been laid out. So racism is the deadliest virus. The data shows it. It's bigger than COVID-19. It's historical. It's been here for hundreds of years. It's been killing Black and brown people. Treat it accordingly. Funding, power, action. Tell us how those three things are laid out. Funding, power, action. If Unite has those three things, great. Make it transparent. Tell us about it, and we will be all behind you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great summary of our view of Unite. I do want to highlight, so Unite is an acronym, and each letter has a team behind it. And Team N, which is this new research on health disparity, I want to sort of draw that out a little bit. Of course, there is racial inequity in healthcare. We know that. And NIH has some programs directed towards that, and that's fantastic, right? But N seems to want to double down on that, which is fine. But as we've talked about throughout this call so far, diversity and innovation are lockstep. And there are many areas where we're lacking the voices of faculty and people and researchers that are Black, that are brown, that are Latinx, Hispanic, and all of the above. Right? So you can fund, I mean, the N seem to want to only fund Black people to work on racial disparity stuff. And I have many colleagues who are Black, who are engineers, and none of them work on racial healthcare disparity. They work on technology for your cell phone. They work on technology for how we make virus quicker. They work on sickle cell disease. All of these things need Black voices in them for us to be competitive. When we make new technology for satellites, we need all people on deck, right? So NIH needs to understand that the funding disparity does not only hit people doing healthcare research. It hits us Black in cancer, Black in neuro. You know, there are many of those groups out there that are still also not getting funded. And we don't see anything right now in Unite that is geared towards that.
Fascinating. Fascinating. So I'm trying to figure out what would be the next best step forward. What do you think would really change hearts and minds? At Bio, we spend a lot of time thinking about how our country likes to talk about differences we see in health outcomes based upon access to healthcare, which is important. But if you don't even have the generation of the scientific solutions, and as you point out, Dr. Enola Adeso, the predecessors to that, the basic research that has diversity in mind, then you never get to the solutions for things like type 2 diabetes and heart disease and stroke, things that are disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities. How should we think about this differently? And I know you've given us lots of great ideas, but what would you recommend people do tomorrow?
Well, I think we all will have different piece of the puzzle, but I would say people need to recognize the power of diverse teams, right? Many of those healthcare issues that you mentioned, the way we engage around them is linked to our racial background, right? It goes back to Dr. Stevens' assertion. Our lives remain segregated in the United States. So that for better or worse, the experiences that I have as an American is inherently linked to my skin color. And so therefore, the way I process problems, any problem you give me a math problem, right? The example that my brain would pull up to solve that math problem is going to be Black. I can't help it because we have segregated. And so when we don't have all of those point of views on the table, we are losing them in terms of solution. It's a statistic problem. You have a problem, you throw all the possible options in, and then you iterate, you will get the best solution. Right now, America is only throwing a small fraction of the possible solution into the box when we innovate, right? So we need everybody who is part of a team right now need to be looking at their teams, right? This is not just an academic issue. It's an issue in our companies. We see examples of this in tech, right? We all need to recognize that we are hurting our nation, our economy, our innovation when we don't pay attention to these voices that are missing at the table. So that's the first thing I would say people can start working on right now.
I want to actually pick up on that and just give another 2 points that have been recently on my mind. The first is this issue, and we touched upon that quite a bit, but I want it to be really crystal clear. So far, we have been thinking about the issue of this pipeline in very narrow and ineffective ways. We have been under the impression that if we gave postdocs, diverse postdocs, a fellowship, our work is done. Our work is not done because these postdocs are going to be pushed off a cliff the first time they apply for a grant. We have to factor that in. So we have to look, and this actually reflects the way I do my science. I think about systems and how they with interacting parts. And I think we need to think about this problem also as a system with interacting parts where you perturb it in one place, you feel the repercussions elsewhere. So we need to think about this holistically and look at the full pipeline from K to leadership and plug all of these leaks, fix the problem. And that brings me to my second point, leadership. We have a problem if our leadership doesn't represent the constituents they manage. This problem has never been more apparent than in the last pandemic year. For those of you who listened to the National Academy's report on the status of women and minorities in COVID, would know that this is one of the huge problems they identified. The fact that the leadership who made decisions about women and minorities during the last year had no idea what the problems were. because they were not diverse. So I think we need to think again about the problem holistically, bring people from the beginning till the end with effective solutions.
I would
I
love to
love
build
that
on
image. Yeah, go right ahead, Dr. Stevens.
Thank you. I would love to build on that with a very specific example from the NIH Request for Information from the UNITE program. One of the parts of the request for information, which by the way is quite well done, is very detailed and everything, and we're very enthusiastic to respond to it. There was one word that really, I think, highlights to me a problem. It was something to the extent of, how can we better engage with more diverse institutions such as historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, okay? How can we better engage? How can we better engage was the word used. We're past the time of engaging, folks. We want to empower, fund, give them power, collect. Okay, so delete the word engage out of all of our white minds. That's actually an example of very insidious racism, okay? No more engaging. We're collaborating. We're stepping down and empowering. We're giving power, we're giving funding, because we realize that it has been not allocated properly in the past now, okay? So in order for this problem to be solved, we have to empower, collaborate, fund, not just engage.
And do it transparently.
Say more about that, Dr. Willett.
As a, it's somewhat, so transparency is somewhat fundamental to what I believe should be happening, right? I think that most of the problems in this world happen because there's a misunderstanding, lack of communication, non-transparentness of what's going on, and what's real and what's fictitious. So I think that the transparency of funding, transparency of power and hiring, like all of it's filling this pipeline, right? Stopping the leaks. How do we do all those things requires communication, transparency, and how, what are we going to fund? How much money are we going to put behind it? What are the actual targets? What are we going to do? I think that what was explained with Unite and why, to some extent, it's a little frustrating is because none of that's there. It's a lot of words that are similar to the words that have been wrapped around things in the past 10 years when we know this problem exists, with no specific targets or actions. If it was a grant, it would be declined. So I think that it wouldn't have been discussed because it didn't have any metrics.
That is tweetable. That is tweetable.
Especially if it was written by a Black PI. Yeah.
So that was great. And the reason why transparency is important is we have a situation where a scientific organization like the NIH in some ways is run as an in-club network. When information is not transparent, people that are on the boundary of clubs will not have access. And part of the disparity is just that. We talk about select pay and how the discretions that program officers have to fund. Most of those things are generated by PIs having conversations, right? How do you know how to approach that? Well, many don't. And so those kinds of information of just being transparent, this is how we will approach our funding. This is how we do select pay. This is what Unite's gonna do. I think Dr. Stevens' point earlier is an important one. This is what we would give in terms of money to Unite. This is what we intend to do with the solution that this committee's come up with. We don't have any of those information.
So I know we're up to the Q&A moment, but I have one last question for you before we open it up to the audience questions. So let's say we take all of your advice and on a dime, all of them are implemented. what would the ecosystem look like 5 years from now?
NIH is about to hire clusters of upwards of 30+ faculty for each university funded through the NIH First initiative. For these faculty to succeed and not be pushed off the cliff, they must first fix funding inequity. If they do that, it could change everything enormously, right? In the next 5 years, it could change enormously. 32 million, or just probably a little bit more now with these new hires. It would change enormously. It would lead to a new generation of highly productive Black scientists who have adequate funding to do the Nature paper resubmission, okay? Which, by the way, is extremely expensive nowadays. It would propel Black faculty to the highest level of power in academia. Power is money, right? Money is power, even in academia, as much as we hate to admit that. More innovative and creative technologies, less mistakes, like the recent pulse oximeter revelation that showed deaths happen because of technologies designed by people that aren't diverse. It would create a biomedical institution that does science by all Americans for all Americans. It's as simple as that.
All right. So we've got an audience question here. We have several. I think we've hit on most of them, but this is one. The NIH, and by extension, the executive branch in which it exists, does not operate in a bubble. How does the panel consider the judicial landscape, for example, litigation on affirmative action, et cetera, and the congressional landscape, such as annual funding, constituencies, et cetera, that impact what the NIH can and cannot do or say? For example, would it be legally possible for the NIH to have an ESI-like program for diverse scientists? What pressures can we put on congressional representatives to support the path towards closing the gaps? And I think this is probably also hitting on how in the closing days of the last administration, there was a prohibition on the use of some language. Now that prohibition has been lifted, but what do you say to this? Is it really even NIH's to fix?
Yeah, well, I'll start and I'll have my colleagues jump in. I think that has been the main pushback that we hear from the NIH, that they don't think it's legal to make a policy that's just going to close the racial funding gap. There has been no specific law that anybody has pointed us to justify this reasoning, number one. We would be open to understand what those laws are. The second piece is that the Constitution of America suggests that we're all equal and we all deserve equal treatment. I'm not saying it the exact way. And so in NIH, focus on not preferentially giving affirmative action, that's a bad word that we all don't want to hear, to Black scientists. How is it okay that they are using tax dollars that all American, Black, white, Hispanic, Latinx, Native American, we all pay taxes. Yet we are disproportionately taking that money and giving it to just one group. That's one way of interpreting what's happening at NIH. How is that legal? You're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry. So, sorry, this is a related question. We were talking about engineering earlier, and there's a question from the audience. I'm a civil and environmental engineer, and I'm curious if a similar study with as much rigor has been applied to the NSF funding dynamic, the National Science Foundation. Any awareness on the National Science Foundation front?
So we don't have the numbers, and I think it's important to highlight that we know the NIH numbers because somebody used the Request for Information Act to get them to release this. So these agencies do not naturally publish this. And NIH was because it's a big component of research funding, so that's why that's attractive. Somebody would have to ask NSF to release their data on race and gender so that we can look at it. We don't have that.
I would like to jump in and say, since we're on the topic, I would like to extend that request for information and analysis to other funding agencies and, that fund science and technology and various other, endeavors in the US government, the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, which actually have large research budgets also, of which we know nothing in terms of their statistics and distribution. So I would love a call for this transparency to permeate all funding agencies of our government.
Both federal and private, right? There's a lot of foundations that work on donations and American donors that don't publish their funding statistics. So I think transparency, tell us what's going on so that one, you know better, right? You need to know what you're doing, especially when you espouse diversity and that you don't publish your funding statistics. So I think that to me, that's another transparency issue that seems to just keep coming up and again.
It could also help us solve the problems, right? If we knew, for example, actually our hypothesis is that NSF might do better, but we don't know, right? Just based on sort of our perceptions of folks that are funded and also the review process and everything else. But it would be great to know that. So that, for example, some of the practices by these different entities that are maybe doing better in terms of equity from a racial standpoint could disseminate best practices, right? And so it could be very practical as well. So, and also to get back to the Supreme Court rulings that everybody's always so concerned about, there's ways around them. And so I just want to say, Unite initiative and folks that are part of that, if you're here right now, consider getting a lawyer team that studies these issues, because we are currently talking with lawyers. And what I can say is they're confident that there's ways around this. And in fact, that's the next publication that's coming out from our group. And so I'll warn you now that it's coming.
That's a great
or y'all can get a jump on us and do it yourselves, right?
That's a great place to wrap up. I have to say, I know you guys have your own independent areas of scientific research, but I hope you're not too busy, because I think you have outlined a career's worth of study here that really needs a deep dive, and so grateful to you for the work that you've done thus far. And we hope maybe I can make a plug, then you can join us for our Bio International Convention in June. So bad to use this stage to plug another event, but I just wanted to say this is such a great conversation and so critical. I hope we can share it with even more people. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah.
Thanks for everybody that came as participants too.